Ladies and gentlemen, let's Gaming Sitcom video. Are the tablets of 3 to 4 years into the future going to be more powerful than the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One? You might scoff and say that just isn't going to happen, that's not realistic, it's not feasible. However, according to the Electronic Arts Chief Financial Officer, his name would be Blake Jorgensen, he actually believes that this is a distinct possibility. He said, and I quote, what gets us most excited is the power, the computing power of mobile devices and the speed of which that's growing. This quote, by the way, comes to us when he was speaking at the Technology, Internet and Media Conference. He continues and says, what that might mean is that the tablet 3 to 4 years from now has more power than the typical console has, and that will open up a new whole set of people to console style games that are more immersive, much deeper, much more character driven than simply static mobile games that you play for small bursts while you're waiting for the bus. So we're looking for ways we can essentially blend these two models and have a more immersive but movable game experience. It could be in your living room, it could be on that bus, or it could also be at a friend's house. Much more portable than it is today, and for us that's a huge opportunity. Now, out of quote, it's worth noting that in the previous quarter, in other words Q4 2014, tablet sales are actually a little lower than what they have been. In fact, it's the first time since the iPad was introduced the tablet sales have been at a bit of a slump, and not a massive slump, but a slight slump. And moreover, the iPad sales were a little bit lower than normal. Samsung's tablets, in other words, the big players are a little smaller, and the smaller players have actually managed to claw some of the market share. Not a massive amount, but even so. Now, you might say to yourself, yeah, but that's all nice, but let's just be totally honest here. There's no way a tablet can be more powerful than the PS4. But that's not necessarily true. There's a couple of points at the moment that you've got to remember. The first is that companies such as AMD, companies such as Intel, and companies such as Nvidia are throwing their hats into socks and trying to effectively reduce the process size and improve performance and reduce the energy requirements of processors. Now, there's two real components which make up, of course, the performance for most games, and that's CPU performance and GPU performance, and you've also got other considerations like memory bandwidth and the amount of RAM and so on. But in terms of GPU performance, it's getting a lot better, to be totally honest. You've got the K1, which has hundreds of G-flops of actual raw computing power, and ironically enough, not ironically, but interestingly enough, it's actually more powerful in terms of the GPU than the PS4 or than the PS3 or the Xbox 360. To give you an idea, the marketing slides from Nvidia, and obviously they are slightly biased, but even so, the marketing slides for Nvidia will point out that the peak performance of the Tegra K1 is 365 G-flops. The PS3, 192. You have to remember though, with the PS3, you do have to take into account the cell processor, which actually pushes up its performance quite a lot, while the Xbox 360 hits about 240 G-flops of peak GPU performance, which is quite considerable. Now, obviously, there are some other considerations that you have to take into account, like texture fill rate, ROPS, memory bandwidth, and so on and so forth, but it's something to bear in mind. And 4 years' time is a long time. 3 to 4 years' time is a long time in computing, particularly when we're dealing at the moment with fairly large process sizes, and they are going to shrink. We know that Samsung are working on 14nm. We have Intel, which are, of course, are doing their own die shrinks, and at the moment, we're kind of phasing out of 28 and we're moving to 22 to 20, so definitely 4 years time I don't see a reason we're not going to be, pretty much everything's going to be on 14, which means that A, there's going to be lower energy requirements, B, you're going to be able to pack more processing power into the same area, and C, because of all of that, you're going to be able to throw more components onto the board, which is pretty excellent. Now, memory, of course, is a big deal, and there's two areas of memory. A would be, of course, the amount of RAM physically on the device. So, does it have 2 gigabytes? The average phone now, for example, has generally over 2 gigs of RAM. But in the future, who knows? As you know, that next generation consoles have 8, although there is a decent portion of that, around 3 gigabytes, allocated towards OS. Now, the other part of this, of course, is memory bandwidth. Now, typically, most devices now are using low-power DDR3 or a version of it, which obviously doesn't have a massive amount of memory bandwidth. The Tegra K1 has a bandwidth of about 17 gigabytes per second, which is obviously not ideal for gaming. However, that's now, and we do know, of course, that DDR4 is going to be coming into the mix and other low-power technologies, and we know that all of the companies are working on this. Hynix, for example, and so on, all putting out something towards the low-power market. So, I'm not saying that necessarily it's going to stamp the PlayStation 4 into the ground, but ultimately the specifications of the next generation consoles isn't really that impressive. Sure, it is considerably more powerful than Xbox 360, it is considerably more powerful than PS3, but the Xbox One and the PS4, they're not that far ahead. And most of the reason behind this is because they were A, produced to be low cost, and B, I don't know why I keep using A and B in this bloody video, but whatever. And the other reason, of course, they were produced to be low cost and, to be totally honest with you, low power consumption, and to be fairly sleek and all of the other bits and bobs. And so you have fairly powerful GPUs with a fairly reasonable CPU, but at the end of the day, there's nothing spectacular about them, and there are some questions as well of DirectX 12, how that's going to integrate to them. And don't forget, the X12 is going to significantly improve the performance in terms of the battery life, for example, of tablets, which is definitely going to be a big deal. Now, I personally, from my own personal standpoint, I'm not really a tablet gamer. I don't really like it. I kind of think, I wouldn't go as far as to say it sucks, but I play the odd game of Temple Run or whatever, but that's about it. And I think it's going to take a lot for me to be convinced. Obviously, some devices, some tablet EE type of devices, some mobile devices, you've got the consoles almost like, say, the Shield, which does effectively use the Tegra K1, and that's kind of a dedicated gaming device. And at the end of the day, I think what AA are basically stating here is that you will be able to dock it, you will be able to link it up to something, which could make sense. Now, I'm not saying, as I've reiterated a couple of times over, that this is going to happen tomorrow. But the other way to look at this is, let's say 4 years' time, which, really we're going to be at like 2018, 2019. Are we going to be seeing rumours of the PlayStation 5 at that point? The Xbox, well, I don't know what the hell we're going to end up calling it. We can't call it Xbox 2, can we? Whatever the balls the next generation Xbox is going to be called. Are we going to be hearing rumours about that? We know that Nintendo, we know they're working on something. We're most likely certain that AMD are helping them, although I don't want to say they are, but it's looking like they are. So, logic would dictate that the next Nintendo console, at least theoretically, as long as they've not just been completely crazy and done a complete crazy thing, it's probably going to be at least as powerful as the PS4. Most likely, if it's released in, say, 1 to 2 years' time, we're most likely looking at 2 years' time, because Nintendo have stated a couple of times that they're not releasing any next generation console this year. This year is Wii U only. So let's assume it's going to be released some point Christmas next year. That means theoretically that system should be considerably more powerful than Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, assuming, as I said, they're not taking the Wii approach again. In other words, producing a very, very, very cheap, low power system. But let's assume they're not, and they're going for at least something with a bit more clout behind it. And I would assume they were if they're taking criticisms of the previous generation consoles on board. So that means that really, a couple of years after that, it's probable we're going to be hearing the PS4 and the Xbox One successor, which means once again the tablets will be behind. However, that's not to say that this is going to continue to happen. There are theories from some in the gaming industry, and I don't necessarily know how much stock I put in them, that there's not going to be a PS5, there's not going to be a next generation Xbox, and instead it's going to be almost cloud services. I don't really think we're there yet. I'd be shocked if either Microsoft or Sony are willing to give it up, particularly Sony. One can argue that Microsoft have slightly less to lose in this, because they could easily sell it with their Windows Azure hardware with the cloud, and of course they've got Windows 10, or God knows what version it's going to be by that point. It's assumed probably even Windows 11. You know, Bill Gates has this whole, you know, your house is going to be a computer and so on and so forth. So maybe we're going to see the Xbox as a service. It's totally unknown. What's really staggering is if you look at the movement of the last couple of years in terms of technology, it's really crazy. Just for fun, because I kind of grew up in the era, I was really young, but I was reading about just kind of the technical stuff behind the Genesis, the Sega CD or Mega CD if you're living in certain parts of the world, the SNES and other bits and bobs, and you're just looking at the stuff. Like the Sega CD had like a limitation of 64 colours on screen at once, admittedly from a larger palette, and there was, I believe, I can't remember what the technique was, but there was a way of getting 128 colours or something like that. This is absolutely insane that we now have this level of performance. And as we were going through some stuff yesterday regarding Brad Wardell and DirectX 12, Mantle, and of course GL Next, they were going into just how much performance we're going to have. Very soon we're going to have hardware and the actual software ability to render something like the Battle of Naboo on hardware that you and I possess. In other words, from a pretty decent regular customer PC, it's going to be able to render the Battle of Naboo. And when one thinks about it, most of this, by the way, is because of improvements to DirectX 12, although you can also extend that to Mantle and OpenGL improvements as well, just simply because it's going to be able to withstand that amount more draw calls. It's going to be able to deal with basically a lot more commands being issued from the CPU, and obviously with CPUs now becoming increasingly multi-core, this kind of works out extremely well. So just to kind of finalize my point, I don't think this is going to happen tomorrow. I don't really know how the market's going to work, and to be honest, this is a theory, and I think by the time tablets move to this point, the Xbox successor is probably going to be close to being out. But it does make some sense, because the Tegra came out at basically the point where the Xbox 360 and the PS3 were. It's just kind of usually works out like that. And if you look at like low power netbooks now compared to say 4 or 5 years ago, you could kind of see how all of this works. And obviously you've got mobile technology, which is generally behind say desktop technology, and you've got desktop, which is generally in front of consoles, and it's just kind of how technology evolves right now. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on it. Anyway, I'd love to hear yours. But anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I shall indeed see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.